completed Psalm 23. We're going to start a series on the Sermon on the Mount. Now, don't get nervous. We're a little over a year on Psalm 23, but we might take that long, but it's not going to be as long as you would think in the Sermon on the Mount. And entitle the series, Living the Sermon on the Mount. Living the Sermon on the Mount. Tonight we just want to do an introduction, but if we go over to Matthew chapter 5, Matthew, of course, records what is known as the Sermon on the Mount. It's not referred to in Scripture as the Sermon on the Mount, but it's become to be known as the Sermon on the Mount, and he records this in chapters 5 through chapter 7. We'll just read the first two verses, and then we'll come back to it at the end. And seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, that is, he's got his position. It doesn't say sat, it says set. He may have sat, we don't know, but he's set, he's in a position. His disciples came unto him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, and then of course what proceeds, or what follows, is the sermon itself. So Matthew records it in Matthew 5, chapters 5 through chapter 7. Luke also gives record of it in Luke chapter 6, verses 20 through 49, but not with the detail of Matthew. Now, Jesus on occasions would reiterate parts of the sermon. We have no record of him preaching it again, but he does reiterate parts of the sermon. For example, if you keep, you don't have to stay in Matthew 5, but if you go over to Luke chapter 12, Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12, and in verse 22 through verse 31, Jesus reiterates parts of the sermon. In verse 22, he says, Therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what ye shall eat, neither for the body what ye shall put on. That's what he said in the Sermon on the Mount. Life is more than meat, and the body is more than raiment. Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap. Again, all of this is a reiteration of a portion of the Sermon on the Mount. And you can read that through verse 31. So he preaches the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew records it. Luke gives an account of it, not with the detail of Matthew. And then there are times in his ministry where he reiterates parts of the sermon. The sermon that Jesus preached is widely known in religious circles, but rarely understood. The vast majority view it as a system of rules and regulations, and there are rules there, but they miss the entire point of the Sermon on the Mount, which is a heart relationship with God that will be manifest in life. Without a heart relationship, you can have all the rules and all the regulations you want. Without a heart relationship, it's all empty. It's all empty. So that's the point of the Sermon on the Mount is he's talking about a heart relationship with God. So rather than a list of rules and regulations, and again, rules and regulations exist. We're not negating that. It is a description of Christian character, the Sermon on the Mount. It's a description of Christian character. Everything in the sermon needs to be viewed through the lens of a life relationship with the Lord. So really, the Sermon on the Mount gives us a portrait. It paints a picture. The Lord was very skillful, of course, and no one painted a better word picture than the Lord. It is a portrait of the effect of a heart relationship with God. Again, you have a heart relationship with God. Now that has, if that is so, that has to have an effect upon our lives. Don't kid ourselves. If it has no effect upon our lives, it has not affected our hearts. And if it affects our hearts, it's going to come out in our life. And this is what the Sermon on the Mount does. It's a portrait of the effect of a heart relationship with God upon how one thinks. You can't have a heart relationship with God and bypass the mind. It has an effect upon the way we think. It has an effect upon the way we act. It has an effect upon the way we react to life. So really the Sermon on the Mount is a portrait of the effect of a heart relationship with God upon our lives lived in this world. It is a description of what God's people should be in this world. In this world. This is the only place we live this life, is in this world. We can't blame the world and the condition of the world. We can't blame that on the condition of God's people. A heart relationship fixes all of these things. Now, Jesus said, of course, follow me on more than one occasion. That declares that He is our pattern for life, but it is also a call to Himself. Follow me. That is a call to Himself. That's the Christian life. It is a call to Jesus Christ. It is a call to His service. It's a call to His service. People may say, well, I love the Lord, I'm just not in His service. Those two do not coincide. This is a call to His service. When He says, follow me, you have to leave whatever it is over here and go after Him. So it is a call to separation. Not just a separation in appearance. There is to be that. But it's just totally separated unto God. Totally separated unto the Lord. Consecrated. It is a call to self-denial. To follow Him, we have to deny ourselves. Follow me is a call to have to recognize that Christ has the preeminence. Christ has the preeminence. It is a call to commit to Him. Again, people say you need to commit your life to Christ. Well, that requires a heart relationship. Otherwise, commitment is a farce. It doesn't last. But when there's a heart relationship, commitment will follow. Follow me. It's a call to trust Him. It's a call to imitate Him. He's our pattern. It's a call to focus upon Him. Again, if you're following somebody, you have to pay attention to what they're doing. You have to be focused. You can't be diverted and distracted in every way. You have to be focused. So, follow me is it is Christ. It is Christ. Not our pursuits, not our plans, not our pleasures. It's Christ. Now, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus declares, I believe He shows us what it means to be a follower of Christ. If we follow Christ, we will be living the life presented in the Sermon on the Mount. That life, again, there's no Christianity apart from Christ. A Christian is a follower of Christ. You cannot live the Christian life separate and apart from Christ. That doesn't even make sense. It means that Christ is the substance, He is the nature, He is the center, He is the meaning of the Christian life. This is why Paul said, we preach Christ and not ourselves. He's the center. Christ is the object. He's our object. He is the purpose of the Christian life. It is Christ being the controlling and dominating influence in our life. And this is what the Sermon on the Mount is picturing. It is a life with Christ has the dominating influence of the Christian life. It is Christ as the passion and the goal and the aim of life. He's our passion. He's our goal. He's what we're striving for. It is Christ. He's the meaning. He's the meaning. What is the meaning of life? To a child of God, it's Christ. To the child of God, it's the Lord. That's the meaning of life. Yes, family's important and many other things are important, but that's not the meaning of life. That's not why we're here. We're here to serve Him. And Christ is the inclination of the Christian life. If there's a heart relationship, that heart is inclined toward Christ. It's not inclined toward the world. It's inclined toward Christ. And if the heart's inclined toward Christ, the feet will be inclined toward Christ. The hands will be inclined toward Christ. The mind will be inclined toward Christ. So Christianity is Christ. And I believe the Sermon on the Mount paints that picture. I believe it's illustrated in the Sermon on the Mount. Notice in John chapter 18. John chapter 18. Verse 36. Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world." Note those words, not of this world. Then go down and read the last part of the verse. But now is my kingdom not from hence. My kingdom is not from the world. Or not of the world. My kingdom is not from hence. It doesn't come from this world. Now, if you back up to the middle of the verse, in light of those two statements, we have, if my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight that I should not be delivered to the Jews. So what he's saying there is, my kingdom is not of the world. My kingdom is not from hence. In other words, its source is not in the world. And then what he's saying in the middle of verse is, if this were not the case, then my disciples would act like everyone else. If my kingdom was of the world, then my disciples would act like everybody in the world. If my kingdom came from this world, then my disciples would act just like you, he's telling his hearers. So it's different. We're different. And we don't have to try to be different. There's something wrong with someone who professes salvation who has to try to be different. You are different. The very moment the Lord saved you, you're different. He made you different. And He's the difference. And that's what's illustrated here in this Sermon on the Mount. So the Sermon on the Mount is an illustration of a life not of this world. Not of this world. A life not from hence. It is an illustration of a life not like everyone else, or unlike everyone else. What is being illustrated is a life that is foreign to the world. What is taught in the Sermon on the Mount is foreign to the world. The life presented in the Sermon on the Mount does not allow us to be assimilated into the world system. It does not allow us to be drawn into the world system. It does not allow us to be fashioned, molded, and governed by the world system. If we're assimilated into the world system, if we're drawn into the world system, if we're fashioned and molded and governed by the system of the world, we're not living the life presented in the Sermon on the Mount. The life in the Sermon on the Mount does not permit us to be assimilated into the world. The Sermon on the Mount will not allow us and does not make any room for us to be spellbound by the world and by the world's pursuits and by the world's ways and by the world's reasonings. We're not spellbound by those. We're not drawn into those things. So the life presented in the Sermon on the Mount presents a clear distinction between the child of God and the world. And what makes that distinction is salvation. Christ saved our soul. There's now a distinction. There's a distinction. And that shows forth in life. We don't have to try to be different. You don't have to come up with weird things just so you're different. You don't have to do that. You're saved. You're different. If truly saved, we're different. The life presented in the Sermon on the Mount, again, is a clear distinction. The life, the things that are said in the Sermon on the Mount are contrary to how the world functions. The world does not function this way. It is contrary to the priorities of the world. It is contrary to that which absorbs the attention and the time of the world system. It is just a life foreign to the world. And it's all because of Christ. So what is being taught in the Sermon on the Mount runs contrary to how the world views God, to how the world views life, to how the world views self, and to how the world views others. The Sermon on the Mount runs contrary to the world's view of God, to the world's view of self, to the world's view of others. It's in the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus said, you treat others as you would want to be treated. That's contrary. The world may deny it, but that's contrary to the thought process of the world. So reading through the sermon, Jesus disrupts the common notions of the world. The multitudes are there and they're listening. He's speaking to his disciples in the hearing of the multitudes. They're hearing this. And it disrupts their way of thinking. It disrupts the common notions of the world. Reading through the sermon that Jesus preached, it becomes obvious that there is a conflict between the principles of Christ and culture. Ever since the fall, that conflict has been. That's not something new. It's always been. There's always been a conflict between the principles of God and culture. So the sermon, as we've said many times, is a picture of vertical living in a horizontal world. The world is horizontal. That's how the world lives. It's more like this, but the world is horizontal. We are to live vertically. We are to live vertically. And we do so in a horizontal world. We don't need the world to become vertical for us to become vertical. Christ has already made that difference. We live vertically. And I believe the Sermon on the Mount pictures a vertical life. A vertical life. It is a call to a way of life. A way of life that is spiritually rooted and driven. It is a way of life contrary to the course of the world. A way of life that is going in a different direction than the thinking of the world. And again, we need to stop. We need to take time. And we need to examine our thought process sometimes and just stop. When we detect that our thinking is going the wrong direction, you need to stop. So it's moving in a different direction than the thinking of the world. When a child of God uses the world as an argument for something they're doing, that's a pretty bad argument. And that's quite a statement that an individual is making. So it runs in a different direction than the ideas and the philosophies and the values and the attitudes and the ambitions and the goals and the pursuits and the behavior of the world. It is a life lived in the reality of God. We need to know God. We need to live life in the reality of God. And just as we said in Psalm 23, we need to live life in the enjoyment of God. It is a life lived acknowledging God's right, God's claim upon every aspect of our lives. God has right. He has full right. He has full claim. It is a life lived with the Lord as the starting point. He's the starting point. He's where we start. He's the subject. He's the source. He's the authority. And I believe the Sermon on the Mount portrays this. It is a description of what a child of God's life should be. A life rooted in God, inseparable from Him, living not merely for Him, but living Him. Living Him. We're to imitate who He is. So it is a call to rise above that which is normal. that which is ordinary, that which is mainstream. I would be worried when you're called mainstream. That ought to scare you. We don't want to be mainstream. A call to an entirely different mindset. It's a call to be spiritually minded. A decided and determined life for God. That's what the Sermon on the Mount is. It is a life, the life portrayed here is a life that is far-reaching. It's extensive. It requires our entire being. You can't just wake up tomorrow morning and say, you know what, I'm going to start following what's said in the Sermon on the Mount. It doesn't work that way. Our heart has to be affected. And then when that is so, this life just extends to every part of our being. It's inclusive of every detail and circumstance of our life. There's no part of our life that the Sermon on the Mount is not to be a part of. So again, it's a life lived above and beyond the norm. It is the tendency of God's people to settle for the level of spirituality around them. Now I said to settle. Perhaps a person is in a great spiritual surrounding, but you're not to settle for that. There's always more. We can always be more than what we are. So we have to be careful that we don't settle for the level of spirituality that is around us. I've often said, and it makes people mad, but it's true. Someone is newly saved, and they'll say, oh, it's so wonderful. They're excited and they're on fire for the Lord. And I said, yes, and they'll hang around us long enough and we'll ruin them. And it's the truth. There's proof everywhere. They just got to hang around a little while and they'll be ruined as far as their level of spirituality. So we can't settle. The Sermon on the Mount is just a higher plane of spirituality. So in the sermon, Jesus is telling us what kind of people we ought to be. And he begins, and we'll get to it eventually, he begins inwardly. That's where he begins. That's where he begins. And that's where it must begin. And then the inward, we get right inwardly, and that results in an outward display. So really the Sermon on the Mount is the Lord's instruction in the kingdom way of life. It is Jesus teaching us how to live as people of God's kingdom in this world. Can there be a better teacher? Jesus teaching us how we're to live in this world. In the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord Jesus Christ himself gives us instruction on how to live life to its fullest. To its fullest. What is presented in the Sermon on the Mount is an abundant and flourishing life. There's nothing depressing here. This kind of living is not going to lead you to be depressed. It is an abundant and flourishing life. It's an extraordinary and victorious life. It's not a life of defeat. The life presented here is a life lived in the peace and joy of the Lord. It is the pathway, if you will, to be happy. You'll be happy if you live this life. So the Sermon on the Mount is a call. It's Jesus saying, this is how you enjoy God's best in life. This is how you can enjoy God's best in life. And how you can experience God's more. And again, if we live this life, the life presented here, it's a serviceable life. It's a very influential life, as is brought out in the sermon. It's a very meaningful life. You don't waste your life living this way. It's not a waste. It's a very meaningful life. And oh, how we need to see and feel the significance and the magnitude of what is being taught in the Sermon on the Mount. It is a call for the here and the now. For here and now. It's not something that we are to put off. And one cannot live this life lax or indifferent. You can't live the life that Jesus presents here if you're lax, spiritually lax, if you're spiritually indifferent. It is a life that requires us to be moved and impacted and influenced by the Lord and spiritual matters, to be moved by these things. And you look around today, and we can even look at our own lives. God's people are more moved by things of the world than they are the things of God. It impacts them more. They get more emotional. They get more passionate than they do about the Lord. That's a heart matter. That's a heart matter. The Sermon on the Mount requires that we possess a spiritual eagerness and a spiritual passion, that we just be enthralled with the Lord and be possessed by a spiritual intensity and a spiritual desire. It is a desire for God, a passionate and consuming longing of heart for the Lord Himself, a pursuit of God. We need to always be pursuing God. And if we're pursuing God, we're moving toward God. We're moving in the direction of God. And we need to, again, stop. We need to stop occasionally and examine, what direction am I going? Because it doesn't take much to get off track. So a kingdom life is a life of Christ's rule. It's a life of Christ's rule. And if we have a heart relationship, we don't have a problem with His rules. We really don't. A way of living in which Christ's throne is established in our hearts. Living with His power within and upon our lives. It's living in submission to Him, in obedience to Him. Living by His design. It's spiritual living. It's right living. And He's our standard of right. Right has to have a standard, and He's the standard. So, what Jesus is preaching here is a vivid reminder that life is not about personal fulfillment. It's not about peace of mind. It's not even about personal happiness. It's not about careers. It's not about achievements. It's not about the acquisition of things. It's not about human approval. It's not about human acceptance. It's about Him. It's all about Him. Doesn't mean that there aren't other things. There are, of course. But it's all about Him. Now, briefly, by way of background, leading to the sermon. In Matthew chapter 4, verse 23, Jesus is preaching, it says, the gospel of the kingdom. He was doing so in Matthew 4, verse 24, that is, as he was doing so. And his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought unto him all sick people that were taken with divers diseases and torments, and those which were possessed with devils, and those which were lunatic, and those that had the palsy, and he healed them. Then in verse 25 of chapter 4, and there followed him, as a result of him healing all these people, there followed him great multitudes of people from Galilee and from Decapolis, an area of 10 cities. That's where the demon-possessed man of Gadara is from, that area. And from Jerusalem and from Judea, and from beyond Jordan. So these great multitudes are following him. Now, this is where Luke's account of the Sermon on the Mount comes in. In Luke chapter 6, verses 12 through 16. That's where that would come in. And following this, in Luke 6, verse 17, Jesus and the disciples go up into a mountain, and it was there that he chose the apostles. And in Luke 6:17, he descends from that mountain, and it says he stood in the plain, that is, a level place. And while he is there, the multitudes came. And Jesus again healed them. Notice in Luke chapter 6, this is Luke's account, Luke 6, verse 19, they've come to the plain, and the whole multitude sought to touch him, verse 19, for there went virtue out of him, and he healed them all. And then they began to press upon him. The multitude is beginning to press upon him, and this is where Matthew 5, verse 1 comes in, and seeing the multitudes, they're pressing in upon him. He went up into a mountain. That doesn't mean he went all the way to the top of the mountain. He just went to an elevated place in the mountain so he could put some distance between himself and the multitudes, and there he was set. The disciples came unto him, and he speaks to the disciples. That's who he's talking to in the Sermon on the Mount. But he's talking also in the hearing of the multitudes. So he's speaking to his own, but the multitudes are hearing it. Now, if we go over to Matthew chapter 7, in Matthew 5:2, he opened his mouth. In Matthew 7, this is the end of the sermon. Verse 28 and 29. And it came to pass, when Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were astonished. This would refer to the multitudes. They were astonished at his doctrine, at his teaching. For this reason, he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. So what this tells us is as Jesus taught and preached this sermon, He did so with great authority. An authority that the multitudes were not accustomed to. There's nothing in the sermon, there's nothing in the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount that is apologetic. Nothing. It's all with great authority. He spoke with authority, and immediately the people could recognize this man is, what he's saying is with great authority. It's with great force. So that's the tone. We need to keep that in mind as we begin to look at the Sermon on the Mount, that it is spoken with great authority. It's Jesus saying this is the way it is. This is it. You know, and as you read the Sermon on the Mount, it's very plain. Very plain. It's not difficult to understand, humanly speaking. It's just very plain. He just lays it out there. It is also, and this part should be preached more to preachers, but it's very organized. Point by point by point. All the way down. It is a lesson in homiletics, the Sermon on the Mount. He doesn't chase rabbits. Never does. Never gets off track. He sticks to his point all the way through. All the way through. He's an example in preaching. He's an example in teaching. He's an example in preparation, how a sermon should be laid out. It's all an example. But most importantly, he is telling us this is how you live. This is how you do it. This is how you do it. Oh, life is so hard. This is how you do it. Yes, it's hard. This is how you do it. You want to make it harder than it is? Do it your way. You'll make it harder than it is. Really, life doesn't have to be as hard as we make it if we would just follow. If we would just follow what Jesus says in this sermon. So we'll begin to look at the Sermon on the Mount. Let's all stand, and Brother Dave will come and lead us in a verse of